I have seen Indians living on their bare and meager reservations with no jobs, with an unemployment rate of 80%, and with so little hope for the future, that for young people, for young men and women in their teens, the greatest cause of death amongst them is suicide. That they end their lives by killing themselves. I don't think that we have to accept that for the first Americans, for this minority here in the United States, that young boys and girls are so filled with despair when they're going to high school and feel that their lives are so hopeless and that nobody's going to care for them, nobody's going to be involved with them, and nobody's going to bother with them, that they either hang themselves, shoot themselves, or kill themselves. I don't think that's acceptable, and I think the United States of America, I think the American people, I think we can do much, much better. And I run for the presidency because of that. I run for the presidency because I have seen proud men in the hills of Appalachia who wish only to work in dignity, but they cannot. For the mines are closed and their jobs are gone. And no one, neither industry nor labor nor government, has cared enough to help. I think we here in this country, with the unselfish spirit that exists in the United States of America, I think we can do better here also.
Okay, so how does he get from, again, sort of this young man with these interests in the 50s and these politics, again, that might be considered somewhat reactionary, or, you know, the other thing that he was known for, obviously in the 1950s, was going after corruption in labor unions. And for a lot of folks on the left, it looked to them like he was going after labor unions, not just the corrupt aspects of it, or going after Jimmy Hoffa and that sort of thing. So how does he make that journey? Well, the first thing that I would say is in my reading of Kennedy, there are a couple of things that do prove pretty consistent throughout his career, that do sort of hold up throughout all of this. First off, he's moralistic throughout his political career. He looks at communism and he looks at corruption in the 50s as a moral problem, something that the United States needs to look at on those terms. The other way that he looks at those issues is that they're a threat to community in American life, and not just the local community, but it does include that, but the national community. That communism was sort of a threat to the fabric of what makes America great, that it threatened family and it threatened religion and all those kinds of things. So he viewed it as an evil system, as Ronald Reagan would declare it decades later. So he's moralistic and he's communitarian in his approach. What I contend is that his focus shifts to seeing the bigger threat to community and to national community in the United States is less so corruption and communism, particularly communism from within in the 60s, as it is people living desperate lives who are willing to take desperate measures in the 1960s. And lots of folks start to see the desperation first when Watts is going to go up in flames, and then Detroit and Newark are going to go up in flames. But Kennedy saw that earlier than that. He saw it from his first years in the administration, because once he becomes Attorney General, there'll be a few ways that he really gets exposed to this problem, and that lead him into it further and further. And so this happens pretty early on. His first press conference that he gives in April 1961, he talks about two initiatives that he wants to get started, along with a third that gets all the press attention. That was going after organized crime. But the other two things he talked about were doing something about inequities in the justice system, particularly problems with bail and people who are poor not being able to make bail and getting a very different system of justice than those who had access to an attorney. And then the other problem, which people were aware of, but they didn't necessarily make a connection between this and poverty, was juvenile delinquency. And so juvenile delinquency was something that scared the pants off a lot of people, the older generations in the 1950s. Think of the movies that reflected that and those sorts of things. So Kennedy was intrigued by this and concerned about it. It was a criminal issue because it was young people involved in petty crimes and that sort of thing. And he was fascinated by young people. He was drawn to young people. So there are lots and lots of pictures as I went through my research trying to put together what I was going to stick in the book. Lots of pictures of him with young people because that was where he actually felt most comfortable. So he's drawn to this issue of juvenile delinquency. And over time, what he and the people around him are going to assess to be the cause for juvenile delinquency is basically poverty. That they didn't have economic and social opportunities. They saw those closed off early in life, and that's what led to frustration and what led to young people making bad choices of lives that were going to lead to crime and no good. And so he starts to try to figure out, how do you do something about this then? How do you deal with poverty, particularly in cities? And he comes up with a kind of a plan that's going to become very important for the rest of the 1960s and beyond, that focuses on how you do open up opportunity at the community level, at the local level. And this becomes a continuing thread throughout his career is, how do you get resources and help from where it can come from, the people who have power and money and resources and know-how in society, to the local community, the grassroots of poor communities, the people who truly were, relatively helpless, that they were boxed out of economic and social opportunities. And so one of the things that Kennedy despised was bureaucracy. So even though the Kennedys kind of get lumped together with LBJ and politicians of the 60s as being big government liberals, in some ways they were, but in other ways they also very much distrusted the federal government and thought that it was very ineffective and inefficient at times. So he'll spend the rest of his career figuring out a mechanism, testing different things, to try to get resources, yes, from the federal government, from the federal budget, to these local communities. But also, he very much believes that you have to bring in private interests, the private sector. Who else has power, wealth, resources in society? Business. He wants to figure out ways that business can contribute to the problem. Churches. He wants to figure out ways that churches can contribute. Universities, even labor unions. Access to being part of a labor union and getting a job where you're protected there was something that a lot of, particularly racial minorities, didn't have in the 1960s. So how do you kind of coordinate the powers that be in society, not just the federal government, to kind of train all their energy at the local level and bypass the people who tend to kind of block progress oftentimes, and that's the people who've been in power for a while at the local level and don't really understand the problem or are more concerned about staying in office. That's the way that he saw and assessed what happened all too often in terms of local politics. So he kind of wanted to stir things up and motivate folks across the board. So juvenile delinquency is going to be a key way that he learns more about the problem and tries to come up with some new ideas. The other thing that it does is it gets him out on the ground talking to people, and that was another aspect of his style, is that he wanted to not just stay in his big Justice Department office, but get out and hear what folks were experiencing, what their lives were like. And one of the things that makes him, in the long run, I argue, kind of this powerful figure on this issue is that everybody knew how wealthy the Kennedys were. He couldn't even pretend to be, like people who were struggling in inner cities or in Appalachia. Everybody knew what their life was like, that they were sort of already American royalty, but still he seemed interested in what was going on, and so that intrigued people at the local level, and they were kind of curious about it, but over time he'll convince more and more folks that he really does care about the problem. And it's helpful then to have someone with that kind of wealth and fame and power who really seems to be looking out for you. So that's going to be one of the keys to why he becomes credible on this issue over time, rather than, I've been asked a couple of times, well, why didn't people think that he was just the term that comes along later is limousine liberal, someone who kind of, drives through and sort of sees what's going on and wants to be a do-gooder, but really doesn't necessarily listen to the people and connect with the people. And he was able to kind of overcome that he wasn't seen that way by the end of the 1960s. So